Greetings hobbyists, this is Artisanzavul, and in this tutorial we're going to have a look at how we can duplicate miniatures accurately so that we can make printable accessories. So this is something I've been asked a few times, and I've given some general advice to people on various different messages, but I wanted to go through this and just talk through some of the ideas and how you can go about duplicating different types of objects. And we're going to start with a relatively simplistic method, and then we're going to go on to how we could go about it a different way and how we'd apply some of the measurements that we get to make this as easy as possible, because sometimes Blender isn't that obvious about how to use any measurements that we've got to make an accurate object. So I'm going to start with probably the most simplistic method, and actually one that's particularly good for round shapes, but there is some limitations to it. So what I've got here is an oval base, and obviously that's going to be quite difficult to duplicate accurately in Blender, or at least I'd want something to make sure that it's right. So all I'm going to do is put this on a piece of paper and trace around it. Now I'm trying to be as accurate as possible using a sharp pencil, and I've got the object so that it is pretty much as perfectly horizontal as I can make it. Now as soon as I've got that, it's just a matter of scanning it, and then I can bring it into Blender. So the way we do this is, firstly I normally go to the view that I want, so I'm going to make sure my Y is facing forward, and I'm going to press Shift and A, and I'm going to go down to Image, and then we go to Background. From there I'll find my image, I'll click on it, and I'll load that background image, and I've got this here, and you'll notice it is not visible when you move around. It is only visible when you go perfectly into that view. So now we need to make this the correct size, and this is the bit that's going to be most important here, is making sure that this lines up. And this is why having this grid paper is really important. So what I'm going to do is just bring this off to the side here so that my cursor's not getting in the way, and then we can have a look at how we're going to make sure this is as accurate as possible. So the first thing I want to do is move my origin, and you can do this if you just move your mouse around, and you'll notice that as you come over here it changes the symbol, and you can now move this, and you're moving the image without the origin moving. So this is quite different to if I just bring that back, if you press G, where you're going to move the whole thing around, origin included. And that icon's normally at the center of the image, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my origin so it is as perfectly as possible on an intersecting corner of one of the squares. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to press G and move the whole thing so that my origin is now perfectly on one of the grids on my background. So you can see Blender has this background grid, and we can control the size of that up here. At the moment I've got my grid, and it is just scaled to 1. So each of the little boxes is worth 1. And for me, because of my units, that is in meters. Now to be clear, that doesn't mean that this image is actually going to be in meters, even though it says it's in meters. I can change this by going down to the scene properties and clicking units. And as I say, while this length is in meters, and I could change it to other things, I found that Blender acts as if one of these units, whatever we're calling it, actually works out to be a millimeter. So regardless of the fact that I'm calling this a meter, or Blender's calling this a meter, when I transfer anything into a 3D print program, this will automatically become a millimeter. Effectively, one Blender unit equals 1 millimeter in almost all 3D printable programs. There are some that you get a choice, but effectively 1 square equals a millimeter, regardless of the fact that it says it's a meter. Now the important point of me putting the origin here is now when I start to shrink this, so if I press S, I've just realized my screencast keys aren't on, so let me just fix that. So when I press S, what that means now is that I'm going to get everything shrinking to and from this origin point. And because that origin point is exactly on the corner of one of my grids, it means that I can quite easily press S and I can fit my grids into the point where they match. Now, I find this easiest and most accurate if you actually go for the furthest possible. So I was actually looking here for this, not to the closest one, because that's the one you're most likely to get wrong. And let's be honest, these are quite wide lines. Whereas if you look to the largest extent of your image, so for example, I was looking here and here, you're going to get this much more accurate. So I'm going to press Shift and A, and I'm going to bring in a curve, not a cylinder. This doesn't often work very well unless it is a perfect sphere to use a cylinder. So I'm going to bring in a curve, and I'm going to bring in this circle curve, which you'll see has a solid fill to it. If you don't have that, you just need to go to Edit and Preferences, and if you come down to Add-ons and type in Extra and select the Add Curve Extra Objects, you'll gain that as an option. So go into Object Mode, press R to rotate, then X because I want it to be on the X axis, and then I need 90 or minus 90 to be the right way round. and then I'm just going to G to move that approximately into the center. I'm going to press Shift and Z to go into X-ray mode and double check that the origin is actually as centered as it can be. Obviously, I'm not able to be perfect about this, and then I can just S to scale it up until it's approximately right there, and then I'm going to press S and X to scale it on the X-axis, and you'll see when I do this, this is why I'm going to use a curve, because this is not perfectly fitting to this edge. So now if I go to edit mode, I can just click one of these handles. I'm actually going to use the curve pen. If you haven't used that before, do have a look at my tutorial. It's new in 3.2, and I can just move this around until it fits. So that is a much better fit. And at this point, we're going to go to convert to and mesh, and now we've got our mesh, and you'll notice that we've got all of this added information in the middle. We don't want this, so I'm going to add a modifier. It's going to be a decimate modifier, and I'm going to go planar. I'm going to change this to about 1, and then go into object mode, apply it, back into vertex mode, and we can see that we've solved this problem of there being too much internal detail. And then because I've got hard ops, I'm just going to press Alt X to symmetrize it. So symmetry there, and then symmetry there. If you don't have hard ops, you can just go into your modifiers and add in a mirror modifier instead, which is just there. So at this point, we've got this object, and then I can just press Ctrl and A, make sure I apply the scale, and then I can go into face mode, and I can press E and extrude that out however much I need it to be extruded. And we've got my base. So that's the simple method for doing rounded objects. Now let's have a look at something a little bit more complicated. So this object is a set of tracks for a model, and I don't quite like the design of these tracks. They are very classic in terms of some old miniatures that had a similar style to it, but this idea that you've got the point where the tracks join together and rotate being the point that's going to be hitting the ground just doesn't make sense. They're going to be the first thing to get damaged. It doesn't work mechanically. Also, I wanted to make something that looked a little bit more interesting and have some variance on this. So let's start playing around, and the first thing I'm going to do is duplicate this bottom section, because this is the bit that connects to the miniature. It's what I'd refer to as a non-negotiable. It needs to be there and it needs to be exactly correct. So for this, I'm going to use a set of calipers. I've put a link to this in the description, or at least this most similar one that I can find on Amazon. I've had these for probably going on a decade and they still work perfectly. Honestly, they're a really sound investment if you want to be able to duplicate things accurately. So I'm going to press Shift and A, and I'm going to start with a cube. And what I'll do is I'll just move off to the side here so that I can put the video up so we can have a look at it at the side. So I'm just going to use the calipers to find the widest point of the object. And we can see that this is 4.05 millimeters. So all I'm going to do is select the object, press N, bring up the item, and I want this in the x-axis, so just here at 4.05. So we've now got that sorted. Next, I need to find the height of this, so the z-axis, and the calipers have a really useful tool for that. It's actually at the back of it, and we can use this to put it between two objects to then give a depth. A lot of people would do this wrong by trying to use one of the other parts of the calipers, normally the top part of it, and that isn't as accurate as this is going to be. And from this, we can see that the height on the z-axis is 2.95, so I'm just going to go in and type 2.95. Now things start getting a little bit trickier, as a lot of these track teeth have tapers, and actually this happens in both angles. So let's deal with this on the x-axis first. So while we've got this having a width of 4.05 millimeters, what we need to do is measure the top part. So relatively quick and easy to do with the calipers. We just need to be careful to do that really at the top. We get a measurement of 3.4, and then we need to put this onto our object. Now the end panel isn't very useful for this, so I'm going to get rid of it. And the way that I normally deal with this is I'm going to go into vertex mode, press Ctrl and R to give myself a center point that travels all the way around, and then I'm going to Shift and Z to grab these two vertices, and then we're just going to GG to move them to the middle. Now, what's very important about this is we need to make sure that this button here, the auto merge vertices, is off. If it's on, when we move this to the middle by pressing GG so it slides along the edge, you'll see that this now automatically merges together as soon as they get within a certain distance. So I need to make sure that's off, and then I can GG to the middle, and these are still separate vertices. So I just want to press G and then X to constrain it to the x-axis. And I could look in the top left hand corner and you can see that I can control how much this is moving and see what's going on there, but trying to get an exact amount is going to be difficult. So instead what I'm going to do is just move it a bit, click, And then you can see in the bottom left hand corner, if this isn't open, then you just need to click on it. And you can see that I've moved, well, minus about 1.1 millimeters. All I need to do is come in here and type in what amount we've got. So we've got 3.4. But because we're moving it from the center, this is actually only going to be half the amount, as in we're doing half the side. So I just want to divide that by 2. And you can see Blender will do the maths for us, so we can just do that really quickly and easily. And I'm just going to go to the beginning and put a minus so that it goes in the correct direction. So now we've got this slight taper for our object, and we can just mirror this to the other side. So I'm going to do this time with the mirror modifier. So we want this in the x-axis, and to make sure this does it right, I need to click those two as well. So now we can start having a look at the other axes. So I'm going to move into the x-axis, and we can start working on the thickness at the bottom and the thickness at the top. And we're going to do this in exactly the same way. So again, I'm going to measure with the calipers, bring out the end panel, and at the base we can see that we want a width on the y-axis of 2.35, so I'm going to type that in. And then on the top we want a width of 1.75. So similar thing, I'm going to go into edge mode, Control and R, vertex mode, Shift and Z, GG to bring it to the middle, and then G and Y, move it a bit, and then I want that 1.75 divided by 2, and then put a minus. So we've got that sorted, and then we can do everything on the y-axis as well. And at this point we've got our tooth for our track. Now what I do want to do is we do need to work out the other parts, so we are going to have a look at the distance between the two. So again, I'm going to measure that, this time with the top part of the calipers that's used for measuring internal diameters and is going to be most useful for this. And now all I'm going to do is just add in another modifier, and that's going to be an array modifier. And this automatically comes in on the x-axis. Firstly, we don't want a relative offset, we want a constant offset. A relative offset measures it in relation to its own shape. So we can see here that it's 1 wide, which means one of this object wide. We don't want that. We want a constant offset so we can say an actual amount. So let's hide the relative offset, open up the constant offset, and we don't want this in the x-axis, we want this in the y-axis. And from our measuring, we know that this is 4.1 millimeters. Now there is a problem with this. If I come into side view, when we make an array, what this does is this moves it from the origin to a distance away as if the new object also had an origin in the same place. So essentially it's imagining that there's an origin just there, and this distance here is 4.1 meters away. But we don't want this being 4.1, we want the distance between one edge of the track to the other edge of the track being 4.1. So if we remember that this is 4.1, all we've got to do is add, well, this bit and then this bit. And bear in mind this is half of a track. What we can do is effectively remember that we're actually just adding one of our track teeth to it. So we need to know the width of our track teeth. And obviously we did measure that earlier, but what if we forgot? How are we going to do that? So usefully, bringing out the end panel, we've got our dimensions, but now my dimension on the y-axis is 7.17. That's including both of the teeth as part of this array modifier. So we can't actually use this to measure what the thickness is, except we can. All we need to do is come over to the modifier stack and turn off the real-time display, and you'll notice that brings back down our thickness, so it was 2.35. So all I'm going to do is come in here and type in plus 2.35, bring that back on, and now these are the correct distance apart. And then we can just do exactly the same thing with the other teeth, because we're going to need to do these for 4 different versions. So we can start arraying those now, just to give us a good visual representation of what's going on. Actually, as part of creating this track, I'll probably get rid of that at some point and then redo it once I've got to a certain point in creating the track, but this is still very useful to have. So let's minimize that array, and we're going to add in a new array. And exactly the same process here. We can do this whichever way we want. So actually, let's keep it in the positive. So we don't want relative offset, we want constant offset. So let's tick that on. And if I just measure that out, we get a distance of 5.1. So I want a constant offset of 5.1 plus the thickness of one of these teeth. So I'm going to take that off, and on the x-axis that's 4.05. So I'm just going to plus 4.05. And that gives us the correct dimensions for our teeth. which I can then up the amount of counts. So we've got 3 and 4, and this is going to be the beginning of our tracks, because these are the parts that need to directly fit into the model that we're making this add-on for. At this point you can see me realizing that I actually hadn't set the scale for these objects, so I'm just resetting that now, and this is why not applying modifiers is so important. It allows you to come back and correct these things after you've done it, if you realize you've made a mistake. Now from this point on, you're just going to see me working on this track, and what I'm going to be doing is making a general shape and then working on it. Firstly, I just wanted to say thank you for making it this far. If you did get through all of this, I apologise for some of the slightly iffy editing. I just got coronavirus yesterday, so I've basically been having little coughing fits throughout this, and some of the more janky edits where you might have seen something jump from one frame to another is because I've had to edit out my coughing as I've been talking through what I've been doing. So my apologies for that. Hopefully it hasn't affected you being able to understand what's going on. The other thing that I wanted to talk about briefly was just this idea of duplicating objects, and just sort of a little bit of a discussion of my point of view on this. Now, you're very welcome to have a different point of view to me, but I do think it is important that I say, when I go about duplicating objects that I've got, for example this track, it's from a company, and I'm not intending on copying this track identically, and you'll see from as I'm making this look notably different because I didn't like the original track detailing. But regardless of that, I generally wouldn't use these techniques to try and directly duplicate models or parts of miniatures, other than where I'm going to make something notably different, or I'm going to be using something as a non-negotiable that needs to be deleted out of an object because it's a connection point. Now, I can only leave this up to you and what you feel is right, but I'm of the opinion that if someone was to copy the designs that I made, I'd be rather pissed off about that. And regardless if someone is working for a company or not, if they've created a design, it is something that's probably going to feel quite personal to them. Regardless of what you might think of a company, if you're going to copy someone's design to be exactly the same, then one, I don't think it's fair on the actual designer that's created this, and also it doesn't really show any creativity. I mean, we're in a hobby of miniature making where people can create things for their own, and that's always been one of the most attractive things about this hobby, and one of the reasons I wanted to get into 3D design was that it allowed me to customize my miniatures even further than I'd normally be able to. And thankfully the world of 3D printing has allowed that to be taken to a total extreme that I never thought would happen when I was a child and I was converting things up with bits of plasticard. So all I'm saying is, as you go through duplicating other miniatures or bits of other miniatures, do have a think about what you're using that for, and have a think if someone was doing that for a miniature that was your design, how you'd feel about that if someone was copying it. Right, that's the moral discussion for me out of the way. If you have a strong opinion about this, you're very welcome to put it into the comments section. I'm not going to massively disagree with you. In the end, your choices are your own, but I just thought I'd share my own thoughts on this. So hopefully you're finding my way of creating these tracks interesting. As I already noted, I am trying to make these considerably different to the original ones. As I said at the beginning, I don't like the design of the pivot point being above the track. This isn't realistic in terms of how tracks are designed. The whole point is that the tracks are designed outside of those pivot points to protect them. And actually, most tracked vehicles nowadays, as far as I'm aware, I'm far from an expert, they go as far as having rubberized tracks, one, to not damage the roads, but two, so that again those moving parts are further protected from the road surface. If anyone knows any more about that than I do, or you want to tell me that I'm wrong, again, you're very welcome to chime in the comments. And I hope you found this video useful, and it's given you some good ideas of how to effectively duplicate sections of objects and get those measurements exactly right.